When OpenAI launched ChatGPT in 2022, CEO Sam Altman became a tech superstar overnight. As the company's valuation skyrocketed, Altman seemed to believe he could do no wrong. It didn't matter how much money OpenAI burned or how questionable its products were. So long as Altman kept promising the imminent arrival of artificial general intelligence, investors couldn't hand over their money fast enough. But venture capital has its limits. Over the past year, OpenAI went on an unprecedented spending spree, signing deals to build more than $1 trillion worth of AI data centers. The problem is, OpenAI doesn't have $1 trillion, and there's no realistic way for them to raise it. Now the company appears to be running out of options. In a recent interview, OpenAI's CFO openly floated the idea of a government bailout. In this video, we'll break down OpenAI's increasingly desperate financial situation, and why the supposed leader of the AI revolution might be on the verge of asking taxpayers for help. OpenAI has commitments to build more than 30 gigawatts worth of AI data center capacity. This will cost $1.4 trillion in total. Their single largest commitment is to pay Oracle $300 billion from 2027 through 2032 for access to new data centers Oracle is building. They have similar commitments with Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, CoreWeave, and many other cloud service providers. So where is this money going to come from? NVIDIA has committed to invest $100 billion into OpenAI as they build out these data centers. We made a video discussing the NVIDIA deal previously. OpenAI also has a partnership with NVIDIA's biggest competitor, AMD. AMD also makes data center GPUs. At least on the high end, their GPUs are widely considered to be inferior to NVIDIA's. On October 6th, OpenAI announced a deal whereby AMD may give OpenAI 160 million new AMD shares. This would result in OpenAI owning approximately 10% of AMD's equity. As of the time of recording this video, AMD's share price is $234. On paper, OpenAI's 160 million shares would be worth about $37 billion. However, there are a lot of strings attached. The 160 million shares vest in tranches. To unlock all of the tranches, three things must happen. OpenAI has to purchase 6 gigawatts worth of AMD GPUs. That is, a number of GPUs that would consume 6 gigawatts of electricity. We don't know how much this will cost. OpenAI has separately disclosed that 1 gigawatt worth of NVIDIA's highest-end GPUs cost $35 billion. The AMD chips are probably cheaper. Let's just say $10 billion. The 6 gigawatts of AMD chips could easily cost $60 billion, far higher than the paper value of the 160 million AMD shares. OpenAI must also reach certain technical and commercial milestones. Finally, AMD's share price must increase. For all tranches to be unlocked, AMD's share price must reach $600. The exact terms of these milestones are redacted, so we don't know the details. On the day before the OpenAI deal was announced, AMD's stock price closed at $165. On the day the deal was announced, it surged to $204, an increase of 24%. Investors viewed this deal positively, a signal that AMD's GPUs are good enough to be used for the most demanding of AI workloads. The first tranche is expected to be awarded when OpenAI purchases the first 1 gigawatt of GPUs in the second half of 2026. We don't know how many tranches there are or how many shares are in each tranche. OpenAI has not yet received any AMD shares. For the full 160 million shares to be vested, AMD's stock price would need to more than double from its current level. AMD's market cap would need to greatly surpass $1 trillion. This seems pretty far-fetched in the near future. It's also important to stress that we have no idea what are the technical and commercial milestones that OpenAI needs to achieve. Let's look at OpenAI's financing needs as of right now. They've made commitments to spend $1.4 trillion. They'll get $100 billion from NVIDIA. They might get up to 160 million AMD shares, which are worth $37 billion at the current market price. But this is highly uncertain. They're still going to need to raise another $1.26 trillion. On November 6th, OpenAI's CFO, Sarah Friar, gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal where she was asked about the company's massive financing needs.
So the innovation on the finance side to pay for it is massive. It of course starts with what I said. We've raised equity as a private company, very kind of typical path, but we've raised a lot. We're building a really healthy business, so free cash flow, CFO's favorite way to fund anything. That is absolutely climbing quickly. But I think the third area we've gotten into is really working with our ecosystem to do some really interesting financing deals. I'm particularly proud of the AMD warrant structure that we put in place just a few weeks back, because it's very strong alignment of incentives. What we've seen is when someone comes out and says, we're going to work with OpenAI, they immediately are often seeing kind of impact on their stock price. And so to the extent that that's going to happen, we would like to have some alignment on that.
She says OpenAI has raised a lot of equity. This is technically true. Since 2022, they have raised approximately $60 billion of venture capital. In almost any other context, this would be considered a lot of money. But this is only 4% of their current financial commitments. Not to mention that most of that $60 billion has probably already been burned by now. She says OpenAI's free cash flow is absolutely climbing quickly, and they will use this cash flow to fund their data center investments. This is a bizarre thing for her to say. OpenAI is not a publicly traded company, so we don't have access to their financial statements. But Microsoft owns a 27% stake in OpenAI. Microsoft has to disclose its share of OpenAI losses each quarter. We thus know that in the third quarter of 2025 alone, OpenAI incurred a net loss of more than $15 billion. Earlier this year, Bloomberg claimed to have seen internal OpenAI documents which show the company expects to burn cash until 2029. Now, the CFO claims that their free cash flow is absolutely climbing quickly, even as it is almost certainly negative, and they just lost $15 billion in the most recent quarter. If anything, their cash burn is likely to accelerate because of all the money they're losing on Sora. Finally, she references the AMD deal. When a company announces some kind of partnership where they give new shares to OpenAI, gullible fools will buy the stock, thus causing the price to increase. OpenAI plans to dump its shares for a quick buck. Basically, a pump and dump. This is what Fryer calls financial innovation, but this is not going to deliver anywhere close to the amount of money OpenAI needs. Take the example of the AMD deal. The first tranche of shares isn't expected to be vested until the second half of 2026. By that time, the pump from the announcement of the deal may have already faded. We don't know if any shares will ever vest because there are multiple undisclosed requirements. Even if OpenAI does vest the shares, this will gross them a few tens of billions of dollars at most, a tiny fraction of their total financial obligations, and it will probably be less than the money they had to pay to purchase the AMD GPUs in the first place. OpenAI is reportedly planning to do an IPO in late 2026 or early 2027. They plan to price the IPO at a $1 trillion valuation. They plan to raise $60 billion of IPO proceeds. This is less than 5% of their financial commitments. The amount of money that OpenAI has committed to spending is so astronomical that it's very difficult to imagine how they can get it. Later on in that same Wall Street Journal interview, Sarah Fryer talks about the role the government could play. This is where things get interesting.
If the timeline on the chip stays short, that gets harder. And so this is where we're looking for an ecosystem of banks, private equity, maybe even governmental, the ways governments can come to bear.
Meaning like a federal subsidy or something?
Meaning like just first of all, the backstop, the guarantee that allows the financing to happen. That can really drop the cost of the financing, but also increase the loan to value, so the amount of debt that you can take on top of an equity portion for
so some federal backstop for chip investment.
Exactly.
At least once every 2 years, NVIDIA releases a new data center GPU, which is way better than the previous version. Given the fast pace of advancement, older generations are likely to become obsolete very quickly. OpenAI knows it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to raise trillions of dollars by selling equity. Over the past 3 years, they've raised $60 billion from venture capital funds, but the pool of available venture capital is limited. That's why they're now planning to do an IPO. Even if they can price the IPO at a $1 trillion valuation, that doesn't mean they can raise $1 trillion of proceeds. To do so, they would need to double their share count, which would tank their stock price. So their plan is to borrow money. Lending hundreds of billions of dollars to OpenAI is a very risky proposition. They are unprofitable, and there is no obvious path to profitability. They're going to use that money to buy GPUs, which will likely become obsolete very quickly. If OpenAI or its data center partners go bankrupt, the lenders can repossess the GPUs. By that time, the GPUs may be 2 or 3 generations old, so it won't be worth very much. Because of these issues, nobody's going to lend $1 trillion to OpenAI. OpenAI knows this. That's why Sarah Fryer is publicly begging for a government bailout. Of course, the optics of this are horrible. A for-profit tech company with the largest valuation of any private company in history is asking for taxpayer money. Within hours of Fryer's interview, Trump's AI advisor David Sachs posted the following on Twitter, quote, "There will be no federal bailout for AI. The US has at least 5 major frontier model companies. If one fails, others will take its place," unquote. To call this a PR disaster for OpenAI would be an understatement. Shortly after David Sachs rejected the bailout idea, Sam Altman made the following tweet. You know he's taking it seriously because he capitalized the first letter of each sentence. He usually doesn't do this in his tweets. Quote, "First, the obvious one. We do not have or want government guarantees for OpenAI data centers. We believe that governments should not pick winners or losers, and that taxpayers should not bail out companies that make bad business decisions or otherwise lose in the market. If one company fails, other companies will do good work. What we do think might make sense is governments building and owning their own AI infrastructure, but then the upside of that should flow to the government as well. We can imagine a world where governments decide to offtake a lot of computing power and get to decide how to use it, and it may make sense to provide lower cost of capital to do so. Building a strategic national reserve of computing power makes a lot of sense, but this should be for the government's benefit, not the benefit of private companies." Unquote. Sam Altman's statement is completely at variance with what his CFO said just a few hours prior. Let's have another listen. This time we'll include a longer section of the clip so we can get the full context.
Are there other types of companies that could help? Is it banks? Is it private equity? Is it deeper relationships with the chip companies? Like, what's the sort of green space in that at this point?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the world of financing today, the world of financing, let's just talk about a data center build. So a 1 gigawatt data center build today is about a $50 billion investment. That's for 1 gig. How that really breaks down is about $15 billion is for the land, power, shell, and about $35 billion is for the chips. And that's real frontier NVIDIA chips that we're talking about. The former is well known from a financing perspective. People know how to finance data centers. They typically have 20, 25, even 30-year lives. Those are easy things, I would say, today to finance. Chips have not been as easy to finance because, number one, I think we're all still getting our arms around what is the life of a frontier chip. If the timeline on the chip stays short, that gets harder. And so this is where we're looking for an ecosystem of banks, private equity, maybe even governmental, the ways governments can come to bear.
Meaning like a federal subsidy or something?
Meaning like just, first of all, the backstop, the guarantee that allows the financing to happen. That can really drop the cost of the financing, but also increase the loan to value, so the amount of debt that you can take on top of an equity portion for
so some federal backstop for chip investment.
Exactly.
The Wall Street Journal reporter was asking her specifically about how OpenAI intends to fund its $1.4 trillion investment plan. Fryer starts talking about debt financing for data centers. In this context, she was obviously referring to financing for OpenAI's data centers, or at least data centers that OpenAI will be using and indirectly funding. She says it's difficult to get financing for data centers because GPUs do not make for great collateral. She wants the government to provide a backstop or a guarantee that will allow the lenders to lend more money. OpenAI might not generate enough revenue to pay back the loans, or the chips might become obsolete before the loan matures. In such a scenario, Fryer wants the government to use taxpayer dollars to compensate the lenders for the default. Fryer is asking for government guarantees, in other words, a bailout. There is no ambiguity, and there is no other way to interpret what she said. Sam Altman does his best to muddy the waters. He says the government should build its own AI infrastructure. This is completely irrelevant and unrelated to Fryer's statement. Fryer was talking about government backstops and guarantees. It makes absolutely no sense for the government to provide a backstop for its own hypothetical infrastructure. Fryer was obviously talking about government guarantees for data centers owned either by OpenAI itself or its data center partners. Now let's review the timeline of events. OpenAI CFO Sarah Fryer publicly asked for a government bailout. Trump's AI advisor David Sachs immediately rejects the idea. After the rejection, Sam Altman obfuscates and says they never wanted a bailout. It's like you ask a girl on a date, she rejects you, then you say, "Oh, you misunderstood me. I never even wanted to go out on a date with you." This is not even the first time that OpenAI asked for government support. On October 27, 2025, OpenAI sent a letter to the US government. In the letter, they proposed that the government should subsidize semiconductor manufacturing. OpenAI and its data center partners are one of the biggest purchasers of semiconductors in the country. They would stand to benefit massively from such subsidies. Sam Altman is probably not feeling very good right now. He signed OpenAI to massive spending commitments which they're probably not going to be able to fulfill. When people are scared, they often lash out in anger. On October 31st, Altman appeared on the BG2 podcast. This podcast is hosted by Brad Gerstner. Gerstner runs a venture capital fund that invested in OpenAI. The point is, he's not some hater or troll. He's actually a supporter of OpenAI. Keep that in mind as we analyze Altman's behavior on the podcast.
is how can a company with 13 billion in revenues make 1.4 trillion of spend commitments? And you've heard the criticism,
First
Sam.
of all, we're doing well more revenue than that. Second of all, Brad, if you want to sell your shares, I'll find you a buyer. If you I just enough. Like, people are. I think there's a lot of people who would love to buy OpenAI shares. I don't think you would,
including myself. Including myself.
People who talk with a lot of like breathless concern about our compute stuff or whatever that would be thrilled to buy shares. So I think we could sell, your shares or anybody else's to some of the people who are making the most noise on Twitter, whatever, about this very quickly. We do plan for revenue to grow steeply. Revenue is growing steeply. We are taking a forward bet that it's going to continue to grow, and that not only will ChatGPT keep growing, but we will be able to become one of the important AI clouds, that our consumer device business will be a significant and important thing, that AI that can automate science will create huge value. So, there are not many times that I want to be a public company, but one of the rare times it's appealing is when those people are writing these ridiculous OpenAI is about to go out of business and, whatever. I would love to tell them they could just short the stock, and I would love to see them get burned on that. But, we carefully plan. We understand where the technology, where the capability is going to go, and how the products we can build around that and the revenue we can generate. We might screw it up. Like, this is the bet that we're making, and we're taking a risk along with that. A certain risk is if we don't have the compute, we will not be able to generate the revenue or make the models at this kind of scale.
There's a lot to unpack from Altman's little temper tantrum. In March of 2025, Bloomberg claimed to have gained access to OpenAI's internal financial projections. This was likely leaked from an OpenAI employee. The leak may have been intentional on OpenAI's part. They thought it would make them look good because their revenue is tripling from the $4 billion they generated in 2024. Now the narrative has shifted. The $13 billion of revenue looks tiny compared to their $1.4 trillion of spending commitments. Sam Altman is very distressed by people who criticize him on the internet. He tries to discredit his critics by saying, quote, "We're doing well more revenue than that," unquote. But are they really doing well more than $13 billion of revenue? A few days later, Altman made a Twitter post. He now claims that OpenAI will end the year with a $20 billion annual revenue run rate. In 2024, they generated $4 billion of revenue. Revenue grew very fast throughout 2025. Thus, the revenue generated during the year will be much less than the ending run rate. It will be somewhere in between $4 billion and $20 billion, probably around $13 billion, the number they leaked to Bloomberg in March. The haters are correct. Sam Altman is moving the goalpost. Very deceptive. And even $20 billion is less than 2% of their $1.4 trillion of spending commitments. He then implies that there is huge demand for OpenAI shares. Tons of people really want to invest in OpenAI. While this may be true, the pool of investor money is limited. If they really had unlimited access to capital, their CFO wouldn't be publicly begging for a government bailout. Anger is born out of fear. If Sam Altman was confident in his ability to raise $1.4 trillion, he wouldn't be so nervous. The reason he's so mad at the haters and naysayers on Twitter is because he knows they're probably right. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about OpenAI? Should taxpayer money be used to backstop their data center loans? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Wall Street Millennial, signing out.